All right, we are recording. Hello, everyone. Thank you for bearing with me and doing this one class asynchronously. I appreciate it. So let's get right to it. I won't take too long. So we're starting a new unit. We're talking about environmental ethics for the last few classes. So this is still within the scope of bioethics. It still raises some of the questions that we've dealt with throughout the semester about our sort of expanding powers over the world, over our own bodies, over non human animals, and now over nature. It raises some of the same questions that we've looked at about moral status, about what sorts of things have interests that need to be taken into account when you're thinking morally about what to do. Um, but it also introduces some new questions, some new ideas, and I am looking forward to exploring those over the next couple of weeks. So I'm going to spend most of this video just walking through some of the recurring themes in the Brennan and Lowe encyclopedia article about environmental ethics. That encyclopedia article should give us a sort of overall survey, sort of situate us, give us some sense of like what the big issues are or what sorts of ideas people have developed in the history of this pretty young field of philosophy. But before we turn to the reading, you know, as as always, really, it's good to start with your own experiences and to start with how at least some of the questions that come up in the reading also come up in one form or another in your own life. So one way to start with your own experiences that I'd like to consider now is I'd like to take a second, and obviously we're not in the same room, so we can't talk about this, but I'd like you to take a second to think about an intense emotional experience that you've had in nature, an experience of intense beauty or intense awe or wonder, just feeling sort of overwhelmed in one way or another, intense fear or dread or something like that. The who knows? Maybe intense anger. I don't know. Think about experiences of intense emotions that you've had in nature or reflecting on nature or looking at nature in one way or another. So describe these experiences to yourself. What are they exactly? The what is it that they're responses to? So if you're experiencing beauty, what do you take to be beautiful here? If you're in awe of something, what is it that you're in awe of? If you're afraid or terrified of something, then what is it that you're afraid or terrified of? You could begin to ask yourself, although this is a sort of jargony question, whether what you're responding to is a kind of intrinsic value in nature, whether you're responding to things that are valuable all on their own, regardless of what they do for people, or perhaps regardless of what they do for non-human animals. Um, I'll add, and one sort of other dimension of these experiences that you might want to explore a little bit is a kind of metaphysical dimension. So by that I mean that some people, when they have these sorts of feelings, when they see, some natural phenomenon, they see a sunrise or they see um, just like a really majestic geological formation, or they see just some natural force which is just sort of overwhelmingly powerful, tornado or river or something. Um, I think a lot of people, not everyone, but a lot of people have a kind of impulse or urge or temptation in one way or another to attribute these feelings to um, something more than just the physical object that's in front of you, to something that isn't the sort of the sort of familiar physical objects of everyday life. So people might something roughly supernatural. So people might have an impulse to attribute these experiences to God. That's what they're responding to. So, lots of theologians will say, well, that's how I know that God exists. I look at the sunset, I see God there. Or people attribute these experiences to nature spirits. So it's like, oh, what I'm connecting to is some kind of, broadly speaking, supernatural life force that is in the tree or in the river or in the mountain. And these sorts of this sort of tendency to attribute intense experiences to novel or supernatural sorts of objects, things that you don't directly see in more mundane everyday experiences. I think exploring this impulse is one way of beginning to analyze these experiences of intense awe or fear or beauty. So ask yourself, do you have that impulse? This impulse to attribute what you're looking at, what inspires these intense feelings, to God or to nature spirits or just something else? Do you well, and if you do, why do you? And if you don't, why don't you? And even if you don't, why do you think other people do? Because it's clearly a human sort of thing. So I think if you explore your own experiences in along the lines of trying to say, what exactly are you responding to? What exactly are the emotions that you're feeling, and what are they directed at? Are they responses to the appearance of intrinsic value? And if you have the urge to do a little bit of metaphysics, come up with or postulate some novel sort of object that your experiences are a response to. Why do you have that urge? Is it reasonable or unreasonable? Why don't you have the urge if you don't have that urge? Why do other people have that urge if you don't have the urge? Okay. I think if you ask those questions, then you might begin to see some points of contact between your own experiences and the ideas in the readings. So how's that for a segue? Let's turn to the ideas in the readings then. So this is an encyclopedia article. Some of it's very juicy, I think, especially for an encyclopedia article. But it covers a lot of ground, and I'm not going to attempt to summarize everything. I will instead just walk through what I take to be I've got 6 recurring themes that the article circles back to, and I'll just sort of briefly summarize those recurring themes and then go into them in just a little bit more detail, and then that's that. So one recurring theme is what sort of conception of intrinsic value, things that are valuable for their own sake rather than for the sake of some future goal that they might help you achieve, rather than instrumental value. What sort of conception of intrinsic value you need to think through our relationship with the natural world. So there is a sort of there are a whole bunch of possible answers to this. Maybe one important distinction, or I think the central important distinction, is between anthropocentric human-centered, person-centered conceptions of intrinsic value, and non-anthropocentric conceptions of intrinsic value. So, anthropocentric conceptions of intrinsic value think that people are where all or most of the intrinsic value in the world is located. So, you might think that, yeah, only human beings have uh, uh, any kind of value for their own sake, that everything else is valuable for the sake of human beings. We already explored this idea a little bit in Kant. I think the basic sort of, the basic response for most of the class is like, yeah, that can't quite be right. But then the question might then be how to expand it. Okay, so non-anthropocentric conceptions of intrinsic value then are just the opposite. They see intrinsic value, at least in large part, in outside of human beings. So it's important that this can take a lot of different forms. So it could just be, we've already finished this unit on animal ethics. So it could be that the non-anthropocentric intrinsic value is only in non-human animals. Okay, so we've already talked about that idea. That's already, under your belts, right? So maybe, according to Singer's principle of equal consideration of interests, anything that has interests has some intrinsic value. Maybe you think that things that have that are sort of subjects of a life, that are capable of suffering, that have some sentience, maybe they have rights, and so they have some intrinsic value. Good. But in the environmental ethics literature, people will adopt more of a broader conception of what has intrinsic value. So not just things, human beings and non-human animals, but maybe also plants, maybe also rivers, maybe also mountains. Okay. Now, you could go one step further, but this is, I think, deserves its own sort of bullet. So one sort of recurring theme here is a distinction between individualistic and holistic conceptions of value. Holism and individualism, those words mean very different things to different people. So just to clarify at least a little bit, here, individualism and holism are temptations to see, or the views that intrinsic value is located in individual creatures or objects or entities. So individual plants, that plant with those leaves right over there. Individual animals, that duck right over there. Individual rivers, the East River, whatever, etc. Holism might see value in collections of things or systems of things in the natural world. So you might see the whole, as some people say, biotic community of living things as something that's intrinsically valuable, or something that at least it's intrinsically valuable for it to be maintained in a certain way. You might see the value of species. So maybe not any individual butterfly that's valuable, but the whole species of a certain species of butterfly, that collection of butterflies might be intrinsically valuable. Okay, so within, the main distinction is between different sorts of non-anthropocentric conceptions of intrinsic value. Some of those are individualistic. They'll see intrinsic value in individual plants, individual animals, individual geological formations, perhaps. But they might also be holistic. They might see intrinsic value in whole ecosystems, in biotic communities, in species, in some things that are somehow more collective than individual. Okay. So those are a couple of recurring themes so far: enlightened anthropocentrism and, anthropocentrism versus non-anthropocentrism, individualism versus holism. Another theme that I think comes up again and again is our aesthetic and emotional appreciation of nature, and whether it needs any kind of metaphysical ground, any ground in a sort of theory of what the fundamental structure of the world is, or what makes things what they are. Metaphysics means different things to different people, but we can take it to mean something like the study of the fundamental structure of the world and what makes things what they are. Um, so that's vague, but maybe it's good enough for government work. It's good enough for now. Um, so the so and this is something that I encouraged you to think about at the beginning of this video. Um, you might think that aesthetic and emotional appreciation, the aesthetic and emotional appreciation of nature needs to somehow be grounded in a novel metaphysical view, a view about maybe it needs to be grounded in panpsychism, the view that everything has some kind of mind or some kind of capacity for consciousness. Maybe it needs to be grounded, or not just capacity, but it actually has consciousness. Maybe it needs to be grounded in a conception of things as made up of their relations to other things, as somehow existing fundamentally as a location in a sort of network, rather than as a thing that's capable of existing independently of any particular network or set of relations. So, good. So sometimes people think of and that seems very abstract, but I think, but maybe you can kind of like you can kind of sympathize with that point of view, right? You can sort of see like, oh yeah, I know how like when you have sort of like cosmic experiences, you can sort of see you might be tempted to interpret them in terms of like the interconnectedness of all things. So that's that means different things to different people, but it can take a sort of metaphysical form. You can think of things as constituted, as made up of their relations to other things, as adopting, as I think the piece might say at some points, a relational ontology, which Arnie Ness attributes to Spinoza. We'll return to that later. Um, so, okay, so there's this question of like aesthetic and emotional appreciation of nature, and whether it needs some kind of special metaphysical ground in a relational ontology, a conception of things as made up of their relations to other things, conceptions of things as essentially locations in networks of a certain sort, and or perhaps your aesthetic or emotional appreciation of nature needs to be grounded in panpsychism. Okay. There's also a question of whether this sort of like this emphasis in environmental ethics, or in your thinking about the environment, on intense experiences of especially gorgeous or overwhelming or affecting parts of nature, whether this is a sort of bougie luxury. It's just like, oh well, it's good for you, Arnie Ness, if you can go on vacation in the mountains, but like working people can't afford to do that, and so whatever if you want a conception of the value of nature that makes sense for working people, it can't be that. Or you might say, well, no, but it's a problem for working people that they can't always, if you don't have access to the right sorts of parks or nature spaces or whatever, that they can't have these experiences, that this is really vital. Maybe it's vital because it encourages you to value certain sorts of things, because it motivates you politically. Maybe it's just vital because it's just those experiences of aesthetic and emotional appreciation are themselves intrinsically valuable. Like, what's life if you don't experience intense beauty or intense awe? Sometimes. There are a couple of so anthropocentrism versus non-anthropocentrism, individualism versus holism, questions about the aesthetic and emotional appreciation of nature, and whether it needs some kind of metaphysical ground, and whether it's a bougie luxury or something more than that. There are also a couple of problems for holistic accounts of intrinsic value, or even just non anthropocentric accounts of intrinsic value that extend intrinsic value to all sorts of non human things. Um, One recurring problem is environmental fascism. Another is misanthropy. Misanthropy means hatred of human beings. The so you know in so you might worry that if somebody, for example, thinks that, I think this comes up often in the overpopulation discourse. So um, the early history of environmental ethics is a response to a bunch of things. It's a response to intense pesticide use and ecosystem collapse. It's a response to um, uh, the mass extinction, lots of species going extinct. It's a response to our sort of increased control over the natural world. It's a response to um, sort of a sort of increasingly clear, at least to some people, sort of a scientific and religious attitude that the world is sort of to be dominated. But it's also a response to what people think of as unsustainable economic growth, and in particular, unsustainable growth in the human population, in the number of people that are out there. And I think concerns about misanthropy, in particular, about hatred of human beings, come up in response to these concerns about overpopulation. Saying, oh well, some people are saying, well, the human population is growing just way too quickly. The Earth just can't sustain it. We use too much stuff. We take up too much space. So we just need to limit or downsize the human population. And people responded, well, hold on. Who are you talking about limiting or downsizing here? Maybe this is an idea that can be used for misanthropic purposes, either for the hatred of humanity in general or for the hatred of particular groups, poor people, people in the global south, ethnic minorities, that sort of thing. So, okay. I think so. Okay, so this is a recurring sort of concern, largely in the overpopulation, or in sort of responses to people raising the alarm about overpopulation. I should say I'm making the case for being worried about overpopulation. I'm trying to explain this objection. I'm not taking a stand one way or the other here on whether we should or shouldn't be worried about overpopulation, or should or shouldn't be worried about misanthropy in overpopulation discourse. Another concern that comes up again and again is a concern about environmental fascism. So, I think the idea is, broadly speaking, people are responding to philosophers like Tom Regan, an early advocate of animal rights, when they talk about environmental fascism. I think they're responding largely to the idea that to a kind of holistic conception of intrinsic value, where individuals might need to subordinate their own interests to the interests of a collective, a group of people. And that might seem a little fashy to you. That might seem fascist. I'll say there could be something to these concerns about environmental fascism. I don't want to just dismiss them, but I think we should be very careful about throwing the word fascism around. So there are connections to earlier or sort of paradigmatic, uncontroversial examples of fascism. The fascist government in Spain in the 20th century, or Italy in the 20th century, governments that called themselves fascist. Okay, so there are clear connections between environmentalism and these earlier governments. There are also, or sort of types of society or systems of value. There are also clear disanalogies between environmentalism and these things. I think so. So just to clarify just a little bit. So earlier forms of fascism are characterized by a lot of things. So they're characterized by an appeal to a mythic past, what life was so great under the Roman Empire. Life was so great before modernity. They often appeal to mystical values, some sort of communion with um, uh, the people, or communion with uh, uh, you know, pagan spirits or something like that. They might involve lastly, they involve the subordination of the interests of the individual to the collective. It's like, part of what your responsibilities are as a good member of a fascist society, is to advance the society rather than advance your own interests. Okay. So there are at least plausible connections between environmentalism and these earlier trends in fascism. So an appeal to a mythic past, thinking that, like, okay, we need to restore the beautiful nature of yesteryear. But we already looked at Johansson. We know that there's a lot of misery in nature, and a sort of idealized conception of what nature used to look like is just false. There might be nice things about nature, but it's not utopia. The mysticism is there, so attributing spirits to things that we don't ordinarily think of as having spirits. Thinking sort of non scientific or non rational sort of science opposition to science, sort of anti science type thinking. That's in there. And if you think that, like, the problem with sort of modernity is the scientific quest to dominate nature. Okay. Okay, all of that stuff is in at least some forms of environmentalism. Okay, so the connection to fascism is clear there. Other features of fascism are not, I think, plausibly in environmentalism. So fascism, in its, in, for example, Italy and Spain in the middle of the 20th century, early to middle of the part of the 20th century, involved an expansion of the military, involved mobilizing a militant youth, Hitler Youth, brown shirts, the phalangists. Okay. It involved a rigidly hierarchical society. It involved a lot of anti-intellectualism, not just opposition to a particular sort of science, but opposition to intellectuals in general, opposition to philosophy in general, and thinking in general. And this is, or sort of, rigorous attempts to understand the world in general. And this is environmental philosophy here, so it's not anti-intellectual. It is a type of intellectual activity. And fascism often works, or typically works, through an identification of a set of internal and external enemies. There's, if you think of Nazi Germany as fascist, there's the Jews and the communists and the homosexuals in the society, and then there are, unsavory forces outside, Slavs or something, that need to be dominated. That is not in fascism. That is not in environmentalism. There's no expansion of the military. There's no youth militias. There's no rigid hierarchy. There's no general anti-intellectualism rather than opposition to a particular strand in the history of science. There's no identification of internal and external social enemies. It's just not, at least there isn't there isn't an obvious one. Maybe you can think of the polluting corporations as the enemy, but that seems to be in some important ways different from identifying the Jews or whatever as the internal enemy. Okay, so that's just to say that the accusation of environmental fascism comes up again and again, and it helps to be a little bit clearer about what fascism means to evaluate those accusations. So anthropocentrism versus non-anthropocentrism. individualism versus holism, aesthetic and emotional appreciation of nature and the questions it raises, these threats of environmental fascism and misogyny. Okay. There's also a recurring theme of sort of trying to explore, and this has already come up a little bit, these themes overlap. There's also a recurring theme of trying to explore the sort of deeper conceptual and metaphysical roots of environmental destruction. So they talk about feminists, concerns about binary oppositions or dualisms, man versus woman, nature versus culture, reason versus emotion, and the thought that one side of the opposition should dominate the other. Men should dominate women. Reason should dominate emotion, and culture should dominate nature. That the ordered world should dominate the chaotic world beyond human intervention. Okay, that's so those sorts of so this is a kind of deep art conceptual root that people have attributed environmental destruction to. That there's this sort of thinking of things in terms of binary hierarchical oppositions and thinking that one side of that opposition should dominate the other side. Okay. Conceiving of the world in terms of natural resources. We talk about natural resources. But why not talk about nature? Why not? The resources are things that you use, and talking about things in terms of natural resources might frame nature as something to be used rather than something to be protected, okay, or let alone. Good. The idea of dominion in the Bible and in Christianity and Judaism. The idea of individualism, the idea that individuals are who are in some sense capable of existing independently, are the loci of value, that they're the places where intrinsic value is located. Some people, that's an idea which comes up again in the reading, that like the reason why we have treated the environment so horribly, at least a reason why, is that we have only seen intrinsic value in these individual sources. Okay. Lastly, a theme that comes up a few times is a tension between radical critique and practical efficacy. So people see the extent of environmental destruction. They see the extent of ecosystem collapse and mass extinction and pollution, and they say that okay, well we need like new theoretical tools. We need to really dramatically change how we think about stuff and how we value stuff in order to sort of take the scale of the problem seriously. So there's an impulse towards radical critique in response to radical problems, and sort of radical transformations of our habits of thought, of our metaphysical thinking, of our evaluative thinking, so on. At the same time, there's a tendency to sort of say like, well, wait, we need to be able to talk to power. We need to be able to reason with people, so that it could be mass people power. It could be power in the commanding heights of the economy and the government. But we need to speak their language. And if you speak the language of nature mysticism, or if you speak the language of intrinsically valuing the biotic community or something like that, well, you've lost people already. You need to meet people where they are. Good. I'll say, just to those are all of the recurring themes. I want to return just lastly to the idea of, because we've considered some arguments, some lines of reasoning here, but mostly it's sort of exploring themes and raising questions. But I want to just end with just a couple of more arguments for that I think you should sort of consider, because philosophy at the end of the day is about reasoning, not just about saying what different people think and mapping out different people's ideas. Um, so, um, so there's the idea of um, enlightened anthropocentrism in the reading, that we can explain all of our obligations to the natural world just in terms of understanding how caring for the natural world will also care for human beings. You could also, I think you could extend this to like not just enlightened anthropocentrism, but enlightened animal centrism, thinking that like, okay, well, we need to care for plants and rivers and mountains, not because they're intrinsically valuable, but because they're necessary for preserving the interests of human beings, but also bears and fish and chickens and dogs and cats and whatever other sorts of animals have interests. Okay, so there's this idea of enlightened anthropocentrism, or we could expand it in a slightly less anthropocentric direction towards enlightened animal centrism. So one question is, why would you ever think that that's wrong? So why would you ever think that this conception of intrinsic value is not adequate to explaining the extent of our obligations to the natural world? So I want to just end with three reasons why you might think that Brennan and Lowe discuss in their section on the history of environmental ethics, the development of environmental ethics. So one reason is you might just think that it's intrinsically important to preserve species. That something bad has happened. Even if there's a species that no one has ever appreciated, that no one's ever documented, that maybe that species isn't a that no one's ever appreciated or documented. If that species goes extinct, that's a real loss. So think of like the last butterfly of a certain species, or the last the last mating pair of butterflies in a species. Maybe from an animal centric point of view, you might think, well, if those butterflies die, if they have interests, if they have, for example, feelings of suffering, then it might be bad for them to die. And okay, well, that's bad for them. But you might think, no, it's not just but then it's just like any other two butterflies dying. But you might think, no, if the last two butterflies of a species, the last mating pair or whatever of butterflies of a species die, that is just a tremendous loss. It's a greater loss than the loss of any old two butterflies. So that's just there's maybe you could argue for that intuition. You could argue for that sort of judgment, but the arguments are besides the point. It's the point, or at least partly besides the point. The main point here is just that like that intuition, that judgment itself might be really hard to shake. And if you really believe that species loss itself is a problem, so species intrinsic problem, regardless of its downstream consequences, regardless of how human beings or other non-human animals appreciate that species, whatever, depend on that species. You might think that like, oh, so that means that the species itself is intrinsically valuable. If there's something more to its loss than the death of its final individual members, the loss of the species itself is a problem. Okay. And I think this is a very common sense idea for a lot of people, right? So if you think that like, the death of the last northern white rhino or something won't just be the death of any other white rhino, it's the death of the last one. It's the death of the species. Okay. So you might be inclined in a non-anthropocentric direction, thinking of, and a holistic direction here, in thinking of whole species as things that possess intrinsic value. You might be worried. One argument is that you might think that like imagine, and this is an argument against anthropocentrism in particular, but think about like environmental destruction after the extinction of human beings. So this is really an alternative to anthropocentrism, not an alternative to animal centrism. But okay, but run with it for a second. So Richard Rutley, who's later changed his name to Richard Sylvan, uh, offered this thought experiment where you just sort of imagine the last person or the last group of people, and imagine that they sort of like they shut their door on the way out. So when the last people are about to die, that they just destroy the earth in the process. If you've ever seen the movie Children of Men, maybe you could imagine what happens and what it would be like if the population of children of men um, you know, set some time bomb to just destroy the planet after they died. Well, if you're an anthropocentrist, then you might think, well, after they died, nothing's of value. After people die, that's it. There's no value anymore. But if you think that, like, no, even after people die, it's bad to destroy the, uh, natural environment, then and maybe if you get rid of like if you get animals out of the picture altogether, you could do a last animal argument. So even if the last animal dies, the last sentient creature dies, you might think that like environmental destruction after that is still awful. Okay, that's a type of non-anthropocentric value. And if you modify the thought experiment to the last animal rather than the last person, it's a non-animal centric value that I think a lot of people will find intuitive. Good. Lastly, and I think this is important, and this is a kind of brass tacks sort of, practical argument. So maybe it's a good place to end because, it's nice to keep things practical. The you might worry that you might argue for the intrinsic values of animals in a sort of legal sense, for legal purposes. So, not the intrinsic value of animals, the intrinsic value of all sorts of natural formations or geological formations or plants or whatever. So, the Sierra Club, an environmentalist organization, has tried to argue in courts that, and they've had, mixed success, that things like rivers and mountains and plants have standing, legal standing, so that if they're harmed, someone can bring a lawsuit on their behalf against whoever harms them. If you don't give them legal standing, you have to wait and somebody destroys a river or something. You have to, some person has to have legal standing. Some person has to be hurt by the destruction of the river. But you might think like, that's too hard it's too hard to find those people, or it's not, in some cases, maybe those people don't exist. So in order for legal purposes, maybe we need to attribute standing, and which is arguably a kind of legal intrinsic value, to rivers, trees, plants, and so on. So if you think that some environmental, if some important part of the environment is destroyed, but no one person or no one organization is hurt enough in the process to have the standing to bring a lawsuit, maybe what you need is legal reform so that the environmental object itself, the river, the mountain, the tree, the whatever, has standing itself so that it can bring the lawsuit, or rather that people can bring the lawsuit on its behalf. So there might be practical legal reasons why you might want to extend standing, which again is a kind of legal counterpart to intrinsic value, to all sorts of non-anthropocentric things, including perhaps some holistic things, whole ecosystems, and so on. Okay, so that is all a summary of the recurring themes in the piece: anthropocentrism versus non-anthropocentrism, individualism versus holism, aesthetic and emotional appreciation of nature, and the metaphysical questions and political questions it raises, class questions it raises. the recurring problems of environmental fascism and misanthropy, especially in overpopulation discourse, and then my editorializing about what environmental fascism might get right and might get wrong, how it might understand or misunderstand fascism, and the deeper conceptual and metaphysical roots of environmental destructionism, dualism and the destruction, and dualism and the domination of nature, or the logic of domination, rather, conceiving of the world in terms of natural resources, the Christian and Jewish idea of dominion, the ideal in the history of science of control or domination, individualism, the tension between radical critique and practical efficacy. And lastly, we just closed with some arguments why you might think of the objects in the natural world or systems in the natural world as having intrinsic value, either because you think it's just intrinsically wrong to destroy species, it's worse than destroying the last members of a species. It's not just like killing any individual members, or because of the last, it's Richard Rutley, Richard Sylvan's last person or last people arguments, thinking that like, okay, it would be wrong for the last people to blow up the world on their way out, and that has to be explained in terms of the intrinsic value of the natural world itself. And lastly, this legal argument that legally, in order to like get the appropriate protections for objects in the environment, we have to give those objects, some of them anyway, legal standing so that lawsuits can be brought on their behalf, rather than waiting for people to be hurt to bring those lawsuits. Okay, very good. Thank you again for your patience here. It's 45 minutes. We'll wrap up there. And I will see you guys on Wednesday.